Thanks very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I am going to, at the outset, say that I'm going to be honest, I wish I will be here in 30 years. So with that said, I'm going to try and be as brief as Wayne, but I can't promise. You notice that they both have technological aids. I don't. As you can see, I'm much more old school. I've got notes. The cover's red. It's an indication of my ideological leaning, but not an indication of political affiliation. Given that we have to talk about young people, I have 16 points to make. And those 16 points, Chair, will each take 10 minutes, so settle in. I'm going to do it in the process of a listicle, because, you know, attention spans these days, especially with young people, is either Instagram, TikTok, or a tweet. I have been working in this arena for a significant period of time, many at old established NGOs, and currently work at the Owl Socio-Economic Research Institute, ASRI, which is a younger, much younger NGO. Nevertheless, on that spirit of youth, let me begin by saying and touching on something that Wayne spoke about, that is the irrationality. And if we think about irrationality, there is something fundamentally irrational about us asking a bunch of people who were part of making a crisis to be a part of unmaking that crisis. So, you know, that's one fundamental problem for me. The second, going through my listicle, is something Stimbile touched on. That is the question of electoral reform. And often we've been thinking about public policy solutions, political system solutions, and engineering them for outcomes rather than inputs. So we're often thinking, what kind of electoral system will we have that is going to give us proportionality and inclusivity and diversity and all those kinds of things, rather than thinking about how do we engineer an electoral system which gives the greatest number and the greatest amount of voice, choice, power, and influence to the individual voter. And in that case, we need a fundamental overhaul even of the new electoral system that has been mooted for 2024. So when talking about political destabilization, those are two fundamental things that we have to consider and bear in mind. First is the question of the irrationality of asking people who were part of making this crisis to be part of unmaking the crisis. And second, that we have to stop thinking about outcomes and thinking about the inputs, about how we design our systems. The third area, and I'm going to now look a little bit beyond ourselves as a society before I return to it, is the third threat to political destabilization or destabilization of the society is an external one. It's the kind of Yankee, gringo, Euro interventionism, and we've seen it happen just about 2 weeks ago, based on fabrications, on fake news, on blatant lies, and so on. But this introduces a problem for us. This kind of Yankee, gringo, Euro interventionism does pose a problem for us. It creates a conflict between what I would call popular sovereignty and protecting our national sovereignty. And we've seen this happen in many places where they have intervened, that the crisis of credibility of domestic governments, which we have and we can't deny it, and a prolonged crisis of credibility leads to a legitimation crisis domestically, which then opens the path for external actors and gives them a pretext to intervene. So if we want to protect our national sovereignty, we've got to give a greater amount of power and agency to citizens and allow popular sovereignty to be the thing that protects our national sovereignty. And we'll only protect our national sovereignty if popular sovereignty gives that agency to citizens through the political system. But in doing so, we also have to be cautious that our own domestic actors don't tell us that when we pressure for democratic government, that we are agents of regime change. So we must get away from this bogey of regime change. in fact, democracies are established on the very idea that regimes have to change if they don't work for you. The only thing we don't want is we don't want external actors to be involved in changing our regime. We are perfectly capable of doing this on our own. Which leads me to the problem of the fourth threat to our political stability. And we've seen this happen already. That is the crisis of representation and responsiveness. All our political parties, bar none, all of them, without exception, are part of making this crisis. Because they appear to be unrooted and unanchored in any kind of constituency of interest in society generally. When they inhabit our public institutions, because the political parties are unrooted, you've got unrooted public institutions who are ambivalent and ambiguous about what their public mandate is. And if your own public institutions aren't able to service the kind of needs, interests, even class interests, which is why my notebook is red. Those class, and it explains why our coalition governments, compared to other coalition governments around the world, are not stable or coherent. Because in many other parts of the world, irrespective of how coalitions are struck, those political parties actually represent interests groups in society, and in many instances, those are class interests. Which brings me to my fifth point. And the fifth point is about the crude and narrow interpretation of identity politics in the current context. That there is this narrow focus on very narrow identities, often imported from elsewhere, and then transplanted on a country like South Africa where the context is completely different. And then you have weird perversions about introductions of terminology like people of color. There's no such thing. You are either big or black, you are an African, or you're a white South African. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. So we don't need to import all of these perversions. And this narrow identity politics, the crude interpretation of identity, has been used as an instrument of political capital, not as a public policy problem to be solved. So that's the third inversion we have to make. We have to correct this perversion of using identity as an instrument of political capital and make it a public policy problem to be solved. So the question of race and racism in South Africa has to be solved as a public policy problem, not as an identity problem. To the extent that it is an identity problem, it is something that might feed our levels of inequality in society, but it can be unmade because there are certain personal predilections and so on that is impossible for public institutions to solve. Those exist in the private realm. But if we want a government to be effective and responsive in the manner in which it behaves, these things have to be treated as a public policy problem. The sixth is the question of credible institutions. I've already touched on the question that our institutions are not credible, they are not even incredible. In fact, they have been terrible. They've been part of destabilizing the society, partly because of the ambiguous nature of their mandate, and this ambiguous nature has led to a legitimation crisis. Chair, the seventh area is us ourselves, civil society, in inverted commas. Civil society, and Wayne has touched on this, can often be uncivil, partly because of the contradictory mandates that they carry, sometimes because of competition and conflict amongst themselves, and so on. Now, partly arising, if you combine the crisis of credibility, the crisis of public institutions, and certain aspects of uncivil society, they can lead to destabilizing protests in society. We've seen that happen over the past 2 decades. And the gaze has somewhat shifted away from these kind of sporadic flash-in-the-pan protests, often serviced, or what people popularly call service delivery. But this was largely a set of protests which are about asking for more responsive government. But they can be a source of destabilization, and we have to be careful about how we respond to those, neither demonizing them, but nor legitimizing or accepting them uncritically on the basis on which they happen. The eighth, and this is going to be an unpopular one, particularly because we're at a business school, is the private sector. The way in which the private sector has behaved in this country with its short-termist, opportunist, and myopic approach has been, in fact, a source of destabilization. They have been a source of deepening the inequalities. And so when there are moments of crisis which affect the business sector, suddenly they're very happy to donate to things like the Solidarity Fund and so on. Where's the Solidarity Fund for jobs? Give people in society the dignity of having work. So if some of you can curtail your excessive executive pay, moderate your long and short-term incentives, put that in a pot, and even in the short term, if there's no direct return, I guarantee you there will be a return in 5 years, or for society generally over the long term. So cross-subsidize job creation if you really want to put your money where your mouth is. The ninth, which is tied to the first three, is the question of political party internal fractures and fractions, a significant force and source of destabilization, as we saw happen in July 2021. When internal fractures can't be managed and internal factions can't be managed, they spill out into the public. Internal party contests not only led to July 2021, remember the streets of Tshwane in 2016 in the lead up to local government elections, where 5 people died. So we have to be cautious about political violence, and political violence has started to morph in our society to victimize and subsume itself under the guise of general criminality, when in fact there are targeted hits either on whistleblowers, on political opponents, or political contestants. The last, tied to the question of the private sector, is the question of technology and surveillance tech, and the way in which surveillance tech is going to be used as a source of destabilizing society. The last one, Chair, is the media. The way in which the media not only sensationalizes, but chooses to cover the wrong things uncritically and without a critical lens. And finally, the question of unprincipled politics. We are in a society in which one day a party will say in Parliament, we want a secret ballot. And in the very next week, will say, no, we don't want secret ballots. No public representative must be allowed to express a public vote in secret. If that is the unprincipled process of politics we will follow, we will have the kind of unrooted politics we saw in Kenya, and we saw what happened in Kenya in 2010, when parties don't have a fidelity to any set of political principles. Thank you very much.